Hi there, and welcome to this video about upgrading from the SharePoint add-in model remote event receivers to the modern SharePoint Online Webhooks and Microsoft Graph notifications. Let me set the context. In the SharePoint add-in model, we used to have the remote event receiver development model to intercept events and happenings on the SharePoint side. It was a model based on a WCF, Windows Communication Foundation endpoint, really tied to .NET framework and based on a Windows and Microsoft only platform. It was a model we used to use in order to intercept events happening on the SharePoint side with a quite complex implementation technique because we had to know quite a bit about how WCF works. It was able to create and manage synchronous or asynchronous events. The synchronous events were also called the ING events because were those happening while we get notified. And the asynchronous one was also called ED event because were the events that were happening after something happened already. In a remote event receiver, whenever you get a trigger, you also get data and information about the target item for the event that got triggered. Nowadays, in the modern development technique, we can rely on the SharePoint Online Webhooks, which are based on an open REST API endpoint, so it can be implemented with whatever platform you like. You are not anymore tied to Microsoft technologies and .NET framework. You can create asynchronous events only, so we can only be notified about something that already happened, and you need to retrieve the data about the target items of the event by yourself for security reasons. So you will not get all of the information about the item, but you will simply get a notification that something happened on the SharePoint side, and then it will be up to you to contact SharePoint Online and to retrieve the actual new data that you are interested in. This model is really heavily scalable and faster and secure compared to the remote event receiver model. And if you want, you can also use the Microsoft Graph notifications, which from an architectural point of view work almost like the SharePoint Online Webhooks, but with a Microsoft Graph notification, you can also get notifications about additional items and not only about SharePoint related items. So let me move to the demo environment and let me show you how you can transition from the old remote event receivers to the SharePoint Online Webhooks. So in this demo, we are going to create a SharePoint Online Webhook using an Azure function built in Visual Studio Code. Right now, I'm in Visual Studio Code and I'm going to show you how you can create such an Azure function. So first of all, Ctrl+Shift+P to activate the command palette, and you will choose to create a new Azure function project. So let me type function, and I will create an Azure function new project. Once I select this option, I need to target a specific folder. So in my scenario, it will be under my temp folder in the SPO Webhook sample folder. And then I want to use C# as the language, and just to make an example, .NET 6 isolated, which is the long-term supported version. Now I have to choose what kind of Azure function I want to create. And in my scenario, a webhook will be an HTTP triggered function. So I will select this option, and the name of my function will be process event, because it will process any webhook event triggered by SharePoint Online. Then I will have to provide a namespace for my generated code, which can be, just to make an example, contoso.functions. And then I need to define the authentication method for my function, which will be anonymous because we will authenticate the request in the webhook implementation, not relying on a function or admin key in the query string, but just relying on the actual message received by SharePoint Online. So select anonymous. Now I'm going to create in the current window the scaffolding of the project. So it will take a while, and in a matter of few seconds we will have the Azure function created. And here we are. We have a process event with the out-of-the-box code just scaffolded. Now, in order to properly implement an Azure function which will handle a SharePoint Online Webhook, we need, first of all, as you can find in the article associated with this video, you need to define a validation rule which will take care of validating the endpoint of the webhook when the registration process goes on. So now that I showed you how to create the Azure function in Visual Studio Code, let me switch to an Azure function that I just prepared for the sake of showing you this solution, and as such we'll see how you can implement a real webhook. So this is a project that you will find also in the samples of the article to which this video is related to. And I have a process event initial implementation of the Azure function for a webhook. Whenever you make an Azure function, or in general, whenever you build a webhook for SharePoint Online, you will need to take care of a validation token which will be provided in the query string, because when you register the webhook, SharePoint Online initially will make a request targeting your endpoint, providing in the query string a validation token. That's why in the signature of my function, I have not only the HTTP trigger with authorization anonymous and get and post supported, but I also have the HTTP request and optionally a string validation token input argument, so that if there will be a validation token query string argument, I will find its value in this variable inside my Azure function. Then if I have a value for the validation token, what I simply need to do is to reply back to SharePoint Online with a status code 200, OK, and providing as a text plain content the validation token that I've just got from SharePoint. So really simple and straightforward, and that's it. We just reply back to SharePoint, and SharePoint is happy because the endpoint is replying back as expected. On the contrary, if we get another request which will be a post request without a validation token in the query string, it means that our Azure function has been triggered by a real notification by SharePoint. So we need to take care of reading the body of the request, like I'm doing right here, and I get the whole JSON text of the request so that I can deserialize the content into a complex object which I defined as a webhook notification object. The webhook notification object represents how SharePoint will notify us about the events. So the webhook notification is made of a value which is an array of events, because the webhooks in SharePoint Online can notify you more than one event at once with just one request. That's why I have every single webhook notification event, which is made by a set of properties, including the subscription ID of the notification, an eventual client state, which will be a string which the webhook can register in its registration and give me back whenever it will invoke my webhook endpoint. I will have information about the expiration date time of the webhook, the targeted resource, so the resource where the event that is being notified happened, the tenant ID, the URL of the site, and the web ID. So a bunch of information to understand what happened and where, and mainly where, because we just get the resource. Then the information about what actually changed on the SharePoint Online side will be up to us to retrieve it with a specific request, which we'll see shortly. So here I get my request, I deserialize it into the complex type, and then we can go through all of the notification events inside the request. Now, if we want to implement a real solution, we need to do something slightly different. So let me close this implementation and let me switch to a more advanced option. So let's say, for example, that we want to actually process the request and to retrieve information about the target of the event we got notified about. So as before, we have the process event function. Right now we still have the validation of the validation token, which is always the same. But now in the processing of the request body, rather than just writing in the output the notification that we get, we actually go through all of the notification items and using the PnP core SDK library, which you can find properly described in another article of this series of articles. We use the get changes method, which allows us to get all of the changes that happened on a target resource since a specific point in time. So here we create a connection to the target site collection, reading the tenant that we have in target from the settings of our solution and reading the site URL from the content of the actual notification that we have got. And we use the PnP context factory to create a PnP context. Then we configure a change query object, which will define that we want to retrieve all of the changes for the items up to 100 items, and we want to get the changes for a specific list, which will be the resource in target for our notification. So that once we have the resource, meaning the document library or the list that I want to monitor, I can simply say get changes and get all of the changes about the items affected by the notification that I'm processing right now. And this method will give me back not only a list of changes that I can browse through. As you can see here, I can do a for each and read all of the changes. But it also gives me back a change token, which is a value that I should save in a safe place, so that later on, when I will make another request, I will be able to restart from that specific change token and get all of the changes from that point in time when I lastly processed all of the notifications. When I browse the changes that I get back from the getChanges method, I simply need to see what kind of change I'm processing one by one, and if it is a change item, so a change onto a target specific item in a list or in a library, I can see what the item ID is of the item that got affected by the change, and I can get by ID that specific item so that I can process it and do something. Now again, this is a good approach, but there is a huge limitation in this approach. Well, what if the processing of all of the changes will take longer than the time expected by the webhooks to run? Well, all the webhooks need to be executed and need to give a response back to SharePoint Online within a predefined amount of time. And if they will fail, then the webhook will be considered not affordable. That's why you should not do processing of your webhooks right after you get the notification, but you should actually send the request to process the changes to a back-end environment which will do the actual processing, and in the webhook by itself you should only process the notification and trigger a back-end infrastructure to do the actual processing. That's why I'm going to show you yet another option, which is the most complete one. In this last scenario that I'm going to show you, the process event Azure function has been slightly updated so that we still have the validation, we still have the processing of the body, and we get all of the notifications. But rather than doing the actual processing of all of the notification right inside the Azure function that got triggered by SharePoint Online, here we simply send a message in a queue. It will be, for example, a blob storage queue, or it could be an Azure service bus queue, but we enqueue a message in an asynchronous queue so that the endpoint processing the webhook will be really fast and lightweight. And then there will be a backend processing of all of the requests. So here we have another Azure function that I created in my function app. This Azure function is called queue process event, and it will be queue triggered and not anymore HTTP triggered. It will look into a queue in the Azure storage account, and as soon as there will be new messages in the Azure storage queue, this function will be triggered and will process those messages. So what it will do will be to get from the queue the message, to deserialize the message to get back the webhook notification. So in the process event, we simply enqueue as a base64 string encoded the message as the notification that we get from SharePoint Online. and in the queue process event, we get back the notification, and if we have it, we do the actual processing. So right here in the backend queue triggered function, we do the get changes that we used to do before in the previous example. Now, this is a safe way of working because here we can take as much time as we need because we are running in background and we don't need to reply back to SharePoint within a certain amount of time. We simply need to process the request. So we do the get changes and we process the actual request. Plus, in this sample, you will also find how to save and restore the change token so that you can actually process your request on the go while running on a daily basis new changes and new notifications. So every single time you will get a notification processed by the backend queue triggered function, you will get the last or the latest change token from a repository, which will be a container in the storage account in which we have also the queue. And then once you are done with the get changes, you save the new and updated and latest change token back into the Azure storage account, so that the Azure storage account will be the repository for the last and latest change token. How can we manage the solution? How can we test the solution? Well, first of all, I can run this project by pressing F5, and it will start listening locally on localhost because I'm running it locally on my machine, and it will start monitoring the blob storage queue for new events to process in the background. It will take a while to start the solution, and as soon as it will be ready, here we are, it will be listening on localhost. However, SharePoint is not able to send a message to localhost. That's why, in my scenario, I also configure with a tool like, for example, ngrok, a proxy so that SharePoint will be able to talk with this public URL, which will be proxied to my localhost internal environment on my local port 7071, as you can see right here. So from a SharePoint point of view, I will have to register my webhook with a public URL. Moreover, in order to do the actual registration, I can show you, for example, how to do that using Postman. Here I have the syntax you should use. You should make a post request targeting the specific site collection you want to register the webhook on, _API web lists, and you will provide the ID of the list that you want to target. In my scenario, it will be a library, /subscriptions. By making a post request to this endpoint and providing the reference to the resource you want to subscribe to, the notification URL, and as you can see, this is the public URL that I have on ngrok rather than the localhost one, which will not work. An expiration date time for my webhook, and eventually a unique string value that I want to provide back to my webhook whenever it will be triggered. By doing this, I can create a registration. As you can see right here, I've got back a registration response. Here I have my registration for that specific resource. If we go back to my Visual Studio Code project, we can see that right here we have the endpoint listening, and there will be a validation of my endpoint using the validation key in the query string. Moreover, I can also check in the list of webhooks making a get rather than a post request if I have my webhook registered. And here we can see that we have something related to Power Automate, and then we have our own webhook already registered right here. So now, if I go to SharePoint Online to, for example, upload a new file in this document library, which is the one for which we registered the webhook, I can go here and I can upload a new file into this library. The file will be uploaded, and within 1 minute or so, we will see the notification triggered on the Azure function side. For the sake of saving some time, I will fade out and fade in, waiting for the message to come. And here we are. The message just came in. We can see that we have got a message in the process event function, and right after that we got the execution of the queue process event, which was triggered by the queue message, and we were able to process our request. So really simple and straightforward. We get the message through the HTTP triggered webhook and Azure function, and we forward the request to the backend function, which will do the actual processing. Now, how can we process the messages? How can we make the get changes? And how can we get the context, the PMP context, targeting the set collection? Well, of course, in order to being able to manage this solution, and again, if you want to dig into this topic, there are other articles in this series of articles that explain you how to, but you need to register an Azure Active Directory application, which I have right here. This is an Azure AD application that I registered in my target tenant. In the application, under Certificates and Secrets, I configure a certificate for my application, and in the API permissions, I configure this permission as an application-only permission, so that the function, the queue trigger function, which will process the webhook, will actually use this application, and with application-only token, will consume SharePoint Online. And this is really the way you should implement your own webhooks in SharePoint Online. Plus, if you want, you can also consider implementing, rather than a SharePoint Online Webhook, a Microsoft Graph notification. If that is the case, the logic is almost the same. This is yet another Azure Function project in Visual Studio. And in the Azure Function project, here we have the notify function. And the notify function we still get from the request in the query string of the request, a validation token query string argument. And if there is such an argument, we will simply have to respond back to graph as we did with SharePoint Online, with the value, with the content of the validation token. On the contrary, if we don't have a validation token, we need to process the request body. And again, as it was with SharePoint Online, we should do the processing in a background task, queue triggered, for example, and we should just get the notification and forward it back to the backend from within the Azure function. Then, registering the Microsoft Graph notification is almost the same as registering the SharePoint Online Webhook, so you need to call an API endpoint of Microsoft Graph to register your subscription. Whether you created a Microsoft Graph notification or a SharePoint Online Webhook, in both the scenarios, your registration will also have an expiration date time. That's why when I registered my webhook in Postman, I provided this expiration date time. Whenever you get a trigger from SharePoint or from Microsoft Graph, you will get back also the expiration date time, so that if you see that your webhook is going to expire, you will be able to patch the registration with a patch request, targeting the subscriptions of the target resource, like for example my library, providing the ID of your registration, which is the value you get back when you do the actual registration and you get back the ID. So for example, this is the ID we should target. And then in the body of the patch, you will have to specify an updated date and time. So I can, for example, do that right here. I can specify the ID of the registration, and I can say that my new expired date time will be in a couple of days from now. Let's do that. And here we are. I've got back a 204, no content, so the registration has been updated and extended. So you have to create a webhook as an Azure function. That's an option, of course. You can use whatever technology you like. But if you are in the Microsoft ecosystem, it will most likely be an Azure function. You make an HTTP trigger function, you register the function as a SharePoint Online Webhook or as a Microsoft Graph notification. Then you can extend the expired date time on the go when needed, and whenever you will get a notification in your webhook or Microsoft Graph subscription, you will always have to handle just the basic information and forward the actual processing to a backend system. If the notification is for SharePoint Online, in the backend system, you will have to use the get changes functionality to get the actual changes to process in your backend logic. Here you can find additional links if you want to dig into the topics we covered in this video. And like always, thank you for watching.